right, I think we can start the meeting now.
Are we recording? Okay. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, General Law, Chapters 30A, Section 18, and the Governor's March 15th, 2020 order imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place. This meeting of the Economic Development Committee will be conducted by remote participation to the greatest extent possible. Specific information on the general guidelines for remote participation can be found on the Town of Southborough's website at https://www.southboroughtown.com. For this meeting, members of the public who wish to watch or participate in the meeting may do so in the following manner by finding the meeting at www.southborough.town/remote meetings. No in-person attendance of members of the public will be permitted, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings at all time by technological means. In the event that we are unable to do so, despite our best efforts, we will post on Southborough's website and/or audio-video recordings, transcript, other comprehensive records of proceeding as soon as possible after the meeting. I'm calling the meeting to order of the Southborough Economic Development Committee on Friday, June 12th at 11:06. I'm going to take a roll call attendance. I'm going to start with how it looks on my screen. Mr. Moorhead.
Yep.
Suzanne Duca.
Yep.
Chris Robbins.
Yes.
Julie Connolly.
Here.
Robert Anderson. Rob?
Johnny's on mute.
Rob, can you unmute yourself? Just... Rob, can you hear me? John Wood here.
There is a message in the chat from Rob Anderson that he does not have audio on that computer.
Okay. So we have a quorum. Does that count as him saying he's here, or we have a quorum with myself and the others? So I think that's good enough anyway, I believe. So call the meeting to order at 11:06. Roll call vote has been attended. First thing on the agenda is the Village Mixed Use District zoning article, a question and answer with special counsel. I know we have a hard stop at 11:30 for Suzanne Duca and myself at noon time. So I am going to try to keep this moving along if I can. So with that, take it away, Mr. Costa.
Yeah. 1 second. Okay.
Yeah, I think that it would be really good to just introduce Adam and let everybody know that Marika and I have had several conversations with him, and we have worked on this considering the time frame that we have for a quorum here. Meanwhile, Kathy's trying to, I gave her the dial-in number, so she's 50-50 right now. I guess she said she did a lot of work on this, but whatever. So we're using the document that was sent out yesterday. I took all of Adam's comments and put them in as footnotes. And I think that for today's purpose, the best way is for him to introduce exactly his understanding of what we're doing for the overlay and his approach. And we'll just take it from there. By that time, it'll be 11:30, and who knows what's happening after that. Okay, so Adam, is that all you need to get started?
It is.
Okay, perfect. Well, I would like to introduce Adam Koster. He is our special counsel from Mead, Talaman, and Costa. Take it away.
Okay, so thank you, Claire, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for having me today. I know you've got some time constraints, and I did hear at least one member say that she's got an 11:30 cutoff and another that has a noontime cutoff. So I saw the proposed agenda of sorts that Marika and Claire had sent to me in terms of how we structure the meeting and giving a 15 or 20-minute presentation on some of these topics. I'm going to try to be even more efficient than that. So maybe I can stop talking sooner than 11:30 and give all of you an opportunity to maybe ask some preliminary questions, or certainly those of you that have to drop off the meeting at 11:30. And then if there's additional things to be said or discussed, certainly I've got no, I can be here as long as needed. So What Claire had asked me to do was to sort of talk a bit about what my charge was, what instruction had been given to me from Marika and by Claire, and what I've attempted to do in the first round of revisions and comments to the village mixed use district. So I was provided with a document that I understand has been or was the result of some discussion, collaboration between boards, discussion amongst committee members and staff and consultant. And I was asked to review it, to make comments on it. You've got those comments in the version that was circulated in advance of today's meeting. And I was also asked to sort of freely and liberally make suggested edits to it. These aren't obligatory edits. I'm not dictating how this bylaw gets crafted. That's your charge. And then ultimately the role of the planning board through a public hearing process and the role of town meeting through a potential adoption. But I was asked to sort of liberally make recommendations. And so that's what I did. For your benefit, all the committee members' benefit, was circulated to you by Claire and by Marika is a version that incorporates all of my red line changes. The version that I sent along to them had more red than black. And so it was very difficult to read. What you've got incorporates those changes. And so I'm not going to walk through all of those now. Certainly I'm happy to discuss any of them if committee members have questions. But what I had sort of hoped to do was to talk, very generally about 2 or 3 points that I think warrant some discussion amongst the committee as a whole, and maybe some additional fine tuning by me before a document like this ultimately makes its way through the remainder of the process. And so the first of these topics, and there's really only 3 of them, I guess. The first of these topics is how we intend to apply the bylaw. You've got a section called applicability. You've got a section that addresses the uses that will be permitted within the overlay district. How is it that we intend to apply the bylaw? How is it that we want to apply the bylaw to achieve our intentions, our goals, our objectives for this downtown area? And a conversation I had 2 or maybe 3 meetings ago or Zoom meetings ago with Marika and Claire was, well, is this the sort of overlay district that is mandatory? Or is it the sort of overlay district that is meant to provide a potential developer or redeveloper with an option? And those are 2 distinctly different types of overlay districts. And they're used throughout the Commonwealth, different cities and towns for different purposes. So we've got overlay districts that are mandatory, like a water resource protection overlay district that is meant to impose requirements and standards on every project that occurs within the overlay district above and beyond what the underlying zoning allows for. And then we've got overlay districts that are meant not to necessarily replace the underlying zoning. The underlying zoning survives, and anybody who owns a property or intends to develop a property within the overlay district has the option of ignoring the overlay altogether and simply utilizing the tried and tested existing underlying zoning, or they can opt to use the overlay district. And my understanding as I began to read this is that this was meant to sort of be the latter type of overlay district, an overlay district that was meant to operate as an incentive to developers or redevelopers, providing for a simplified process, a streamlined process, and a process that provided for more certainty and also opened the door to different types of uses, mixed use in particular, but also different types of uses within a mixed use development. But that owners of property within the overlay district would have the option, if they so choose, to do what they've always been able to do, which would be to develop pursuant to the underlying zoning. If that's the case, then I think that there's some fine tuning that's necessary with respect to these 2 sections, the applicability section and the uses section, because the applicability section seems to suggest, at least the way that it's currently written, that any non-residential type of development, any mixed use development, and any strictly residential development with 2 or more units would be subject to this overlay district. So that reads as more of a mandatory requirement than making the overlay district available as an alternative to developers. It then goes on to talk about various, I'll call them triggers to the applicability of this bylaw. And the triggers are significant. There's a whole host of them, ranging from new building construction to changes in building use, significant alteration to building facades, So I would say that 90 to 95% of anything meaningful that is going to be done to a building or a group of buildings within the overlay district is going to be subject to the overlay district requirements. So that needs to be read in conjunction with the uses, and the uses, the way that you've structured them here in section 6 of the bylaw is you provided for as of right uses, you provided for special permit uses, and you've certainly achieved the objective of opening the door to the sorts of uses or simplifying the process for obtaining permission for uses above and beyond what would be allowed pursuant to the business village district, the underlying zoning. But you've also not addressed some of the uses that would be permitted pursuant to the underlying zoning. So I compared the two. And as I look to the business village district, I see uses that are allowed as of right that aren't referenced here in the as of right section. I see uses that are allowed through a planning board special permit that wouldn't be allowed, seemingly wouldn't be allowed pursuant to a special permit or by right for that matter under the overlay district. Same thing with ZBA special permit. So the two sections, the underlying zoning and the new proposed overlay district zoning, need to be read sort of side by side, the uses compared. And again, if you're providing for an overlay district that is meant to be an alternative, then there doesn't need to be that consistency because it's either or. If I want to develop a veterinary clinic within the overlay district and I look to the overlay district bylaw and say, well, I can't do that, it's okay because I can still utilize the underlying zoning. But not if this applicability section reads the way that it reads, because it's a non-residential use, and it would seem that the overlay district is mandatory for all non-residential uses. So I think that there's some further discussion that needs to occur and some clarity that needs to be added to these two sections, applicability and uses, both by right uses and special permit uses. So that's sort of the first topic that I think warrants some further discussion. The second topic that I think is of some importance is what's the process and procedure if we now turn strictly to the overlay district? If I'm developing a project pursuant to the overlay district zoning, what's the process and procedure for me to get a building permit to proceed? And the way that this originally read, it was sort of complicated. We talked about some by right uses and we talked about some special permit uses, but with respect to the by right uses, it also spoke of 100% conformance with the terms and conditions of the overlay district, which would include all these design standards and performance guidelines. It talked about a review by the building inspector and the planning board and the zoning board to ensure this 100% compliance. And it didn't define the process or the procedure for these reviews to occur. Boards only act as boards through a quorum of its membership at public meetings. So if I have a by right development proposal, do I then need to not only meet with the building inspector, but get before the planning board and the zoning board at public meetings? And how is it that they're approving what I'm seeking, confirming that it's 100% in conformance with the bylaw? So what I've done through my revisions is something that is more typical of overlay zoning and quite frankly, any type of zoning, where you're providing for opportunities to develop a variety of different types of uses or mixed uses. And that is, once you define the by right uses and you define the special permit uses, to provide a process and a procedure where the by right uses either can proceed strictly to a building permit and the building inspector performs a cursory review if that's all that's necessary to ensure and confirm compliance with the bylaw, or if there's a desire to perform a more comprehensive review because of the size, the scope, the nature of a project, you subject it to a non-discretionary review process like site plan review. Site plan review it's a one-stop shopping at the planning board. It's non-discretionary. So although I understand that there may be some history of the planning board denying site plan review, and that happens from time to time in different communities, they're not generally supposed to do that. It's a non-discretionary by right process. But there is a purpose to that site plan review, which is to ensure that all the requirements are met if you don't have confidence that the requirements are sufficiently objective enough for the building inspector to perform that kind of cursory review to verify compliance with the bylaw. So I've proposed that as a structure. That doesn't mean that's what this committee has to support. We can talk through some other alternatives. I've also proposed it in such a way where I've simply referred to the underlying zoning provisions concerning site plan review and said, if you've got a by right use that is referenced in this zoning under section 6.1, uses available as of right, whether it's a mixed use development or it's a community or neighborhood center or a retail use not to exceed 8,000 square feet. If you've got one of these by right uses, you either proceed directly to a building permit, or you are subject to site plan review only if the underlying zoning requires it. And the underlying zoning only requires it in a few instances. Your bylaw concerning site plan review is not quite as all-encompassing as some other communities' bylaws are. And so you have the ability to do that, to simply incorporate and rely upon existing zoning, or you could simply say within this overlay district that any of the by right uses require site plan review and approval from the planning board. And that would provide for greater oversight by the planning board. That could be viewed as a positive thing. That could be viewed as a negative thing, depending upon your perspective and depending upon the perspective of a different. I think that one thing that has been made clear to me in my discussions with Claire in particular is that the objective here is to incentivize development and redevelopment in the downtown area. And so, and this is a good segue to sort of my third talking point. If you're seeking to incentivize development, you want to present a bylaw that is read as doing exactly that, as simplifying not only the process and procedure, but also the substance, what's required of a developer. If a developer reviews an overlay district bylaw that is meant to simplify the process, but talks about visits to 2 or 3 different boards for discretionary or even non-discretionary reviews, and then incorporates 2, 3, 4, 5 pages of performance standards and design guidelines that are some mandatory, some subjective and not necessarily obligatory, that uncertainty is going to be off-putting for a developer, and the developer is going to say, no, I'm going to stick with the underlying zoning because it's been in existence. I know it's required of me, and I don't see the benefit of proceeding with a development pursuant to the overlay district. And so for that reason, what also came through the discussions with Marika and with Claire is we took the latter portion of what was presented to me a month or so ago. Previously, it was section 9, performance standards, and a subset of that section 9 was a section or a subsection entitled design regulations. And in the version I had, the entire bylaw was 9 pages, and 5 of the 9 pages, or 4.5 of the 9 pages, so about half of the bylaw, were these performance and design standards and guidelines. And the recommendation that I made is they were substantial. And I'm not a planner. I'm the first to say that I'm a lawyer. I'm a consultant with respect to the crafting of zoning bylaws, but I can't speak to whether a particular design guideline or standard is proper, or what the added cost would be to a developer and having to comply with it, or whether it fits your vision for the downtown area. That's something you need to determine through conversations amongst yourselves or with other consultants. But what I can tell you is that as someone who not only represents primarily municipalities, but also has some development clients, I know the mindset of a developer. And a developer is going to look to a 9-page bylaw with 4.5 or 5 pages of design guidelines, a substantial majority of which were subjective, and say, I don't know what's required of me. And to the extent I do know what's required of me, and I'm reading these subjective standards as being obligatory, there's a whole lot that I've got to do that's going to result in added cost. And so my suggestion was that we move these into a separate document, rules and regulations or guidelines of the permitting authority, which would be the planning board, whether it's through a site plan review process or a special permitting process. And that they can more easily be adopted and amended that way because they don't have to go to town meeting each and every time. You also have the flexibility to distinguish within the rules and regulations what is an obligatory standard and what is a recommendation. So, turning to some of what you had in the previous version of the bylaw, you referred to appropriate street furnishings. You refer to appropriately scaled development. You talk about adequate lighting. You talk about high quality materials and encouraging this and recommending that. And that sort of terminology, number one, even if you included it in the bylaw, it's very difficult to use that as a basis for denial, where you've not said to a developer, you've got to do this or you've got to do that. And then second of all, it provides no real guidance to a developer as to what is expected of him or her or it when they make their application. So I would suggest not only shifting these, moving them out of the bylaw and placing them in a separate document, but also carefully working through them and determining which of them should use terms like shall or must to insist that they be complied with, and in making that determination, consider what the added cost might be or inconvenience might be to a developer, and how important the standard is. And then to the extent that they're going to be non-obligatory, optional requirements, say so, and understand that you can't necessarily use that as a permitting authority, and by you, I mean the planning board really, can't use that as a basis for project denial, but it certainly sends a message to the majority of developers that that's what is desired, and many, if not most, will comply. So those are sort of the three topics I'd hope to talk a little bit about. There's a lot more to say. Obviously, you've got a substantial bylaw here, and I've made a lot of revisions and comments on and to it. But with that, I'm going to stop talking. We've got about 5 minutes until the 11:30 hour. So I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chairman, and happy to take questions and continue to discuss.
You're muted, John.
Sorry. Susan, do you have any questions since you're the one that has to take off first?
Not specifically yet. I wish I could stay for the rest of the conversation, but I will catch up afterwards.
Okay, I'll open up to anybody else on the board. Any questions or comments? No one?
Hi, I do. Sorry, I was unmuting. This is
Okay.
Julie.
Hi,
Hi,
Ms. Conley.
just want to thank you, Adam. I think this is a really great start, and I think there's a really fine line to be walked between having, we talk about design guidelines or rules and regulations, or however we want to frame them. One of the issues that I think is aside from the very restrictive bylaws that are currently in place, I think one of the other issues is that, what we've heard from developers who have tried to put projects through is that there seems to be a lot of subjectivity. So I think that's a very sensitive point, but also, we're working on this for a while, and we know what's important to our town and our residents, and certainly to us as well, is that, we want any project that comes in to fit within the downtown. People in South Borough love the historic feel, the sort of bucolic country feel. So, I think that having design guidelines is important, or however we want to frame them. But I think you raise a really good point where we don't want to scare people away any more than we already have been for the past several decades. So, I think what you were trying to say, and I think I agree with this, is that to the extent we do have any design guidelines or rules, or whether they're baked into the bylaw or separate, they should be very specific and clear cut, so that the developer or party coming in to put in a new business or a building or a project knows exactly what they're getting into and can say, okay, well, my sign needs to be this large, and I need this many, this much lighting per whatever. And, or lighting needs to be of this variety. I know lighting is a big topic in town right now about what kinds of lighting are appropriate. So to the extent we can work in things that are specific but not subjective, I think maybe that's where we strike the balance of making sure that we're not scaring developers. They know what they're getting into. We're maintaining, some control over what is allowed, and at the same time, limiting subjectivity and limiting, the possibility that a developer spends, a significant amount of time and money on a project that gets rejected for something that, is pretty subjective after making that significant investment. That's all.
I apologize. I was having some email issues and computer issues, and I read the last document. I'm just looking at the new one now with all your comments on it, so I apologize for that. Did we get any feedback from any of the other committees or boards on this yet, on what they thought? Because for all these design guidelines and things on what should be in and shouldn't be in, I think that's a great one to have the discussion with planning on, to see what they thought of it. So I don't know if they've had a chance to see this yet.
Don, the only person on a committee that it has been sent out to is Mimi. And I also sent a copy to Sam because he typically attends meetings and he is planning on coming in at some point in time. But the reason that it was not sent out is it's because of the changes and everything. It's not ready for prime time until you guys decide that it's ready to, it's a draft document. And until you guys decide that it's ready to go out, because this is a public meeting, now it has to be a document that's available. So it'll be ready to get sent out.
Okay. Yeah, I think the feedback from the other boards and committees now, it sounds pretty important to me on a lot of these different things, because there was a lot, almost half the document that was put together was omitted because it was seemed subjective and different things. So
What you have to realize is that the reason that all of that came out, don't forget, this document, guys, initially was something that was put together using a framework from another town where it worked. So it was just to have something to be able to start working on. And so that's why there was a lot of that. It seems like a lot of the document was cut out, but not really, because it wasn't, it really wasn't applicable.
Right.
And when Adam took a look at it, you know, that's, we went on the recommendation as discussed.
okay.
Okay.
Thank you for this. If we take out everything about the process, or is the subjectivity portion, should we put something back in that guides the process, or just says, here's what we should be doing, or here's what you can be doing if you're using this, now you have to go to XYZ's committees, or do we have to mention any of that in here, or should we?
Sure. So through you, Mr. Chairman. So I attempted, again, the charge that I got from Claire and Rika was, to the extent that you can make changes that incorporate your recommendations, make them. So with regard to, for example, the performance standards and design guidelines, I actually didn't strike them in the version that I prepared. I just highlighted them and said, you might consider moving these into a different document. Not all of them are subjective. And so there are some that could be salvaged. For example, the lighting provisions and the signage provisions were relatively objective in terms of, you know, was required or is required of an applicant. Others were highly subjective, and you could either modify those to be more objective and continue to incorporate them, or you could eliminate them altogether and place them into a secondary document. There's also something to be said for the extent to which you can apply either objective or subjective standards. Part of the challenge here is that what you've done in this document, and it's what you would want to do in an overlay district that is to incentivize development in a downtown area, is you've opened the door to certain types of development that wouldn't be permitted pursuant to the underlying zoning. You've increased the maximum gross square footage of non-residential uses from 2,000 that would trigger the need for a special permit up to 8,000. That's a good thing in terms of availability of uses and simplicity of permitting. You've allowed for mixed uses. That's also a good thing. So you've done all of that in the bylaw. If I'm proposing a use that is allowed by right because it's retail and it's under 8,000 square feet, there's an obligation on the part of the town to approve that. It's a by right use. And so even if it's subject to a site plan review process, the expectation is that because it's by right, I'll be allowed to do it. And so if you've then got 3 or 4 or 5 pages of design guidelines that are, whether they're objective or subjective, the planning board is put in a difficult position when it wants to apply these. The project doesn't really comply with them, and it wants to use that as the basis for denial, because you've already determined, town meeting has already determined by virtue of adopting the overlay, that the use is a by right or as of right use that is allowed. It's not a special permit use. If it's a special permit use, it's a game changer, because then the planning board has that discretion to deny the project for non-compliance. What I've done in the version that's circulated is I have incorporated, because it was easy enough to do, this dichotomy between special permit uses and by right uses, and I've said that the by right uses are subject to site plan approval. I've already done that. That's incorporated into this document. What I haven't done, because I didn't have the guidance from this committee and didn't know what your objective was, quite frankly, is I haven't sort of reconciled the applicability section with the uses section, or the overlay district entirely with the underlying zoning. And so let me just give you an example of what I mean by that. Let's say the developer, I own a parcel of property, it's a vacant parcel of property, and I want to build an 1,800 square foot retail facility. Gross square footage, 1,800 square feet. Well, if I go to the underlying zoning, the business village district, and I'm looking at it here, permitted uses up to 2,000 square feet include retail uses, retail sales. So I can develop pursuant to the underlying zoning an 1,800 square foot retail facility. It's by right. I don't have to go through a site plan review process. I don't have to do anything except go to the building inspector and get a building permit. Now, that same developer looks at the overlay district, says, okay, if the overlay district is not obligatory, if it's optional, if it's an alternative to the underlying zoning, we'd have to modify the applicability section, and looks at the as of right uses and says, oh, look, as of right uses are retail sales up to 8,000. So whether it's up to 8,000 or up to 2,000, I'm at 1,800 square feet. So I still qualify as of right. But now you're telling me under the overlay district, I have to comply with 4 pages of design standards and performance standards. Why would I do that? Why would I go through a site plan review process so that can be imposed when I can just develop the underlying zoning? So that's what I mean about decisions having to be made and reconciliation having to occur between applicability and uses. This overlay district is going to be in place of the underlying zoning because, as had been alluded to before, I think maybe by Julie, the objective is to have greater control over what the downtown will how it will be developed, how it will look aesthetically, how it will be designed. If that's the objective, that this overlay district be all encompassing, and that anybody who wants to do something in the downtown area has to comply with this document so you know what you're getting, well, then you have to be mindful of uses that you're not including in this document that are today allowed pursuant to the underlying zoning. Because now you're saying that those uses are no longer allowed. And if the uses already exist, you're essentially rendering them non-conforming. You have of dimensional requirements. Currently, you've got a minimum 10,000 square feet, whereas under the overlay district zoning that you're proposing, you've upped that to 15,000 square feet. So now again, you're rendering some uses non-conforming, or you're making it more difficult in that respect to potentially comply. So overlay district zoning is confusing only in the sense that you have to reconcile it with what you're overlaying it onto, and be sure that if it is a mandatory overlay zoning district, that you recognize what you're getting and what you're sort of phasing out.
Yeah, no, understood. I do. I think our objective is to incentivize. I mean, I think once we started throwing in the design standards, that was almost as a way to have some control over what went up. So I think it's appropriate to put that somewhere else if it's with planning board, as long as we get the buy-in from them that they would be taking that upon themselves through the overlay process. So I'm fine removing it if everybody else is as well. And if we get buy-in from the other boards.
Hey, real quick, just a thing of process. Susan had to bounce, so I just want to confirm we still have a quorum. We do. We have Mr. Moorhead in attendance, myself, Chris Robbins, Julie Conley, and Robert Anderson, and Kathy Bartolini. So we still have 6 people. So
I'm stuck in the audience.
but I hear you. Yeah, still Kathy.
Oh.
I can hear you.
Oh, I haven't been talking because I was told I was in the audience and I kept trying to get someone to move me up and didn't.
If that's what keeps you quiet, you're still in the audience. I'm only kidding. But I just wanted to confirm we still have the quorum, so everybody knows that does watch this or is in the audience. So thank you. And I apologize for the interruption.
Mm-hmm.
And Rob had a question.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question of Adam? It's Kathy. Hello?
Yes, you may.
Yeah, Adam, I'd like to talk a little bit more about doing the overlay bylaw, and the implications of making some buildings non-conforming, because that kind of hit me square in the eyes yesterday as I was reading your rewrite. Would those things that exist currently in the downtown would remain conforming, right? Because they're there under the underlying zoning. They wouldn't automatically become non-conforming?
So through you, Mr. Chairman. So the answer is, in most cases, yes. Typically with respect to overlay districts, the objective in an overlay district, when it's this kind of an overlay district, a village center or downtown overlay district, it is meant to incentivize development. It's meant to provide a streamline and a simpler process for development, sometimes with some additional guidance or sometimes with an additional number of requirements that are meant to incentivize things like, for example, shared parking or common driveways. But in most cases, because that's how the overlay is crafted and the underlying zoning remains intact, and an applicant has an option to use one or the other, that is typically the benefit of an overlay, that you don't, because you're not replacing the underlying zoning, that uses that were developed pursuant to the underlying zoning aren't rendered non-conforming. The point that I was making is the way that this currently reads, in some respects, some portions of it, the way it currently reads, it's obligatory. It's not just an overlay district that is providing an alternative. It's an overlay district that is saying, if you intend to do any of these things, new use, converted use, aesthetic changes to your building, changes to your accessory building, then you trigger this bylaw, and thereafter you're required to comply with this bylaw. My concern would be that you could potentially be rendering uses non-conforming with respect to future changes.
Yeah, I agree, because I had it in capital letters as I was writing down I was amazed at, because, like, for an example, right, the shared parking bylaw, it's supposed to specify how long it will stay in existence, but we're dealing with businesses. We're dealing with small businesses. Nobody knows how long they're going to be in business, even when it's your own money that you're investing. So, because things may not work. Vast majority of restaurants don't make it. So then you've got a building. Now you've used the overlay district provision, and you've got a shared parking agreement that you entered that may be null and void relative to building B versus building A, because B's gone out of business and now you're trying to bring somebody in to fill the vacancy. And I think that building's non-conforming because it doesn't have the parking it needs unless it re-enters into the shared parking bylaw, the shared parking agreement. Am I right?
Potentially, that's correct.
Okay. Okay, that was one of the thoughts I had, and I definitely share your opinion that we have too much specificity relative to how high the walls will be between the parking and the pedestrians and the sidewalk and access to the bill. I mean, there are things to think about, but when you specify 3 feet versus 6 feet, and I don't agree with 6 feet, period, never mind whether I agreed with doing it this way, and then you tell them what percentage of the planter needs to be green versus other plants you might put in, but 80 to 85% shall be green. And I understand we're trying to get the stuff to be alive 12 months a year, but still, we just we're just over describing it. Another thought I had was I don't think the current draft makes it clear enough to the applicant that there's a standalone sign bylaw that I don't think this overlay supersedes. Does anyone else on the board, EDC, think that we have coordination between the sign bylaw, the existing sign bylaw, and what's being proposed here?
I can't say that we put that much effort in.
Okay.
Referencing.
All right.
I mean, I don't think so, right? I think we started with the sample that we had and
Yeah.
crafted the way we wanted, right?
Mhm.
Rob Anderson had a question. I think I've got him so he can speak, but I'm not exactly sure. Rob, can you try to get in now and speak?
Can you hear me, John?
I can now. Great.
Okay.
Now I understand why you were quiet.
Yeah. Well, the question I guess is going to come up from the development community if we're asking them to participate and use the overlay. That if they have a by right use and they come forward with a proposal that fits within the four corners of that by right use, and then they end up in front of the planning board, and the planning board's a little bit more subjective design guidelines are in their purview, and there's some level of disagreement. It's a by right use, they can do it, it fits all of the check boxes, and then the planning board has these subjective design guidelines. What protections does the developer have, and what protections does the town have to make sure that this project can happen as the town is hoping?
Would you like me to attempt to address that?
Please.
So I want to clarify first that what we're talking about is a by right use, because I think it's, as I said before, a bit of a game changer if the use triggers one of the special permit requirements. If it's something that is coming before the planning board, not in the site plan review context, but as an application for a special permit, and the planning board has these external design standards or design guidelines, some of which are subjective, and opts to deny the project for non-compliance, the planning board is on solid ground because it's a special permit. And as someone who litigates, a fair portion of my practice is litigation on behalf of municipalities, often defending decisions, site plan review, special permit, et cetera, I will tell you that 75, 80% of the time with respect to special permits, when they're denied, municipal boards are affirmed because municipal boards, planning boards, zoning boards are entitled to a degree of deference, and they decide. It's a discretionary review process. So they're guided by the special permit standards in your existing bylaw. But if they determine that a project is inconsistent with neighborhood character, or that there are concerns with respect to vehicular circulation or pedestrian safety, they can deny the project. So if we don't look at that and we look at what I think the question's asking, which is if it's a by right process, a by right use.
Yes.
And the process is go to the planning board to get site plan approval. And yet the planning board has these design standards or guidelines that they're now attempting to apply through the site plan review process. Do they have the authority to adopt those standards and guidelines? Absolutely. Do they have the authority to apply the standards? I would say that they do, but I think that the level of review and the deference that they're entitled to on appeal is different, especially if those are not really standards, but they're guidelines. And I use those two terms not interchangeably, and the law recognizes this. So standards are preferably objective and they're obligatory, they're mandatory. You've got to comply with a standard. You shall do this, you must do that. Guidelines tend to not be obligatory. They use words like should, or they suggest what's appropriate. And again, I quoted from some of what was in this version of the bylaw that you proposed. And so if the planning board has this list of, let's call them standards and guidelines, guidelines, and there's some shalls and there's some shoulds, and they attempt to apply these. And there's an appeal because they use them as a basis for denial. The developer is unhappy with the denial, says this is a by right use, how can you deny me? And appeals that to the courts. The courts are not going to afford the planning board the same degree of deference that they would have afforded it if it were acting on a special permit application. It's going to be an uphill battle for the planning board because the court's going to say, well, wait a second. It was already determined in the bylaw through town meeting action, determined by the people, that this is a by right use. And so there's a case decided at this point about 25 or 30 years ago where the court said, listen, with respect to site plan approval, there are very limited circumstances where a planning board, as site plan approval authority, can deny site plan approval. And, you know, they're the obvious situations, the applicant, you know, hasn't submitted complete information or hasn't paid the application fee. And then there are extreme circumstances, and that's what the court said, that there have to be circumstances where the municipal board, the planning board, can envision no set of conditions that would allow for an approval that would be consistent with the purpose and intent of the bylaw. And so, to answer your question more directly, if it's a site plan approval process versus a special permit process, the board's not going to be entitled to that deference and isn't going to have the same degree of flexibility in attempting to apply these standards and these guidelines, or at least not to use them as a basis for project disapproval. And the planning board needs
Okay, so if I might, because I'm very much in favor of developers having the by right uses in that location because it offers them a little bit of flexibility and chance to bring them forward. If we remove the design guidelines from the zoning, and a developer does come forward with a by right use, they have some protection that what they're proposing can go forward, even if there are some standards from the planning board that kind of encourage certain elements, correct?
That is correct. And you know, the challenge that I've found in working with different municipalities and different municipal boards is getting the boards to understand that difference. The how you distinguish a site plan review process from a special permit process, and what authority a board has, a planning board has in this context, to apply standards or guidelines in a site plan review context versus in a special permit context. Because I can affirm exactly what you just said, that yes, there's some protection for the developer, but if the planning board wants to ignore that and wants to treat a site plan review application the same as it would treat a special permit application and apply these guidelines and standards rigidly to an application for site plan review and use them as a basis for denial, then while the developer may ultimately win, that sends a message to the community that developers are only going to win after litigating the case. And we all know how long litigation takes. That case will be in land court for 2.5 years, minimum.
And that's what we
John?
want.
John? Hello?
Go ahead, Ken.
John?
Yes?
Okay. Earlier in the conversation, Adam suggested that we could remove the 4 to 5 pages of recommendations and guidelines and parking and all that sort of stuff, that if we wanted to remove that and put it in a standalone document, saying that these are the types of things that the approval board or boards will be looking at when reviewing the project. My experience has been that when they stand alone as the guidelines, the developer knows beforehand that, okay, this is what they're going to look at. It's either too costly and I don't want to do it, or I'll bring something in at the beginning that covers that kind of stuff, and it'll be a negotiation. And most of them want to get to a quick yes, so they attempt to the greatest extent possible to design a project that meets the obvious. And if they can't, we even have a provision in this draft that says if you can show why the parking, for instance, is not feasible, then that standard won't be applied. So I, for one, think that would be better to remove some of this and put it in a different document, because we have guidelines for subdivision approval and that sort of stuff already. So we're kind of there is some precedent for approaching things that way.
Do you want to make a motion and put it to a vote?
Do you want me to? I mean,
Well,
are we ready for that?
Well, we haven't even, I mean, this is a draft document it's the first draft of the draft document. So, I mean, that's something that I think it's a good idea to have it as a standalone document. We've talked about that in the past, having guidelines to make it easier. So I agree with you on that. It's up to the committee. Do you think it's something we should take a vote on? Do you think it's, or just make a, it's just a discussion on the draft, just have that as a guideline? Mr. Moorhead.
I think somehow in here, we have to say all this by right, and you guys tell me, all this by right is subject to design review per these guidelines in this document. And as much as we can take out of here and put into that guideline document for the village mixed use, I think is a good idea, because that's another interest that we have, is having some dialogue with the developer or some standard to hold them to build to, that they're going to build in this style or like this. And I don't think that has to be in here, but I do think that somehow we want to say that there's a design review process that we want to implement in here in this overlay district, that so that we can avoid that, the question that Rob was asking, like how do we avoid a stalemate? But I think that we somehow still have to have a design review if you're going to build per this overlay district.
I agree.
I agree with that. There's one thing we're taking a risk on. We have spent quite a bit of time talking to the planning board and to the bike path pedestrian committee, open space, etc. And a lot of the guidelines for bike parking, etc., access to the downtown is sort of like improvements in their perspective that I would think would be in their perspective, improvements and thought it to be guarantees, and to have it be out of the document and into a guideline document, which I do like, but we have to anticipate that there might be, no, I only am going to vote for this at town meeting if I get what I want. We don't have adequate bicycle accommodations and circulation in the downtown. We don't have adequate historic preservation. We don't have, and that each one is going to look for their interests to be defined in section such and such, and prefer to see it in the bylaw as opposed to in a guideline book, even though I'm the one that is pushing for the guideline book. But I can see that being an issue down the road when we're counting towards our 2/3.
Yep.
Mr. Chairman, can I make a comment?
Mm-hmm.
There is some sort of a hybrid approach here that might work. I'm sensitive to the politics of these sorts of bylaw adoptions. You need the 2/3 majority at town meeting. To get that 2/3, it's critical that you have a planning board report following their public hearing that supports,
yes,
ideally unanimously supports, but certainly supports the adoption of the bylaw. That goes a long way at town meeting in my experience. And than that, it goes a long way when you don't have that planning board support. And so I'm sensitive to a desire, certainly by a planning board who will be the permitting authority, whether it be site plan review or special permit granting authority. I'm sensitive to their desire to have certain guarantees kind of baked into the document that is being adopted at town meeting and not separately accepted or separately approved. What I will say is this, and this goes to the concept of a hybrid approach. Not everything that was stricken necessarily needs to be stricken. And I'm looking at the document that was most recently circulated to the committee, but I'm comparing it to what I reviewed and what was originally presented. The substantial majority of what was originally presented and thus what has been stricken was already written in such a way that it was not obligatory. In fact, in the document that I provided to Marika and to Claire, I highlighted and put in bold blue text every word that was subjective, should or may or recommends this or suggests that. And they were all over. I mean, the pages were littered with these highlighted terms. So for the most part, already they were functioning more as guidelines than as standards. So moving those out of the bylaw doesn't do anything different. And we can explain to the planning board and subsequently to town meeting that even if they were in the bylaw, they were recommendations and they really wouldn't necessarily serve as a basis for disapproval of an application. Some of them, however, were objective and used words like shall. And so we could preserve those. And for example, looking at pedestrian and bicycle access, which was a point just made, that was actually very subjective. It talked about how parking areas should be designed. It talked about site plans should provide for continuity from sidewalks along public streets, and walkability should be considered and given primary importance. So that was very subjective, whereas landscaping standards were very objective. Side yard treatments were very objective. It talked about specific distances and how those distances should be addressed through landscaping or walls or otherwise. Parking areas, trash and service areas, those were all addressed in a very objective manner. Some of that could be preserved in the form of bylaw provisions. And you can even go so far as to, in addition to preserving them in the bylaw, then provide a waiver provision. So maybe we go through these 4.5 pages of primarily subjective design standards and performance standards, and we convert some of the shoulds to shalls. We preserve those that already say shall. We work all of that back into the bylaw, but then we include a waiver provision in the bylaw that gives the planning board the ability to waive those on a case-by-case basis in the interest of design flexibility and consistency with the overall purpose and intent of the overlay district and what is sought to be achieved in the downtown area. That provides developers with advanced knowledge of what they're going to be held to as objective mandatory standards. It tells them that there is a way to get around it in certain circumstances through a waiver process, but then it also incorporates some other guidelines. Maybe it's only 2 or 3 pages of other guidelines that might be used to shape a project. They'll be available to a developer in advance because the planning board will have adopted them, but they're not going to serve as a basis for disapproval. Your hope is that in 80% of the cases, you're going to have developers that want to get to a yes as quickly as possible. And so they read those guidelines and they incorporate, 70 or 80% of what the guidelines recommend into their plans, and the planning board can approve them. And obviously they'll incorporate everything that is a shall and that is worked into the bylaw as part of their plans, because those are obligatory standards.
Yeah, I like that approach. Yeah.
I do too.
John, just wanted to say that Lisa has raised her hand if she wants to.
I was just going to say, I'm trying to speak, just keep going directly to mute on me, and I apologize. Smartphone, smarter computer than me. Ms. Braccio has her hand up and had for a minute. I'm going to allow her to speak. Lisa, if you just state your name.
Sure. Lisa Braccio, 13 Oregon Road in Southborough. I'm a member of the Board of Selectmen as well.
Thank you.
Just a couple comments. I think this was a very enlightening discussion today. I would suggest that in the spirit of collaboration and partnership moving forward, I think we all recognize for this to get to town meeting and successfully pass a town meeting, we all need to work together and collaborate. Based on some of the changes and the discussion on the rules and regs for the planning board and such, I think it might be useful, and again, as a suggestion, to, through this process, as you're making changes, keep the planning board and the Board of Selectmen updated as to what's going on. So you would hate, at the very least, for a planning board member to object to something when it could have been dealt with at this stage versus going forward, just so we could all be on the same page going forward, present to the town a united front, on what's going to be presented. So that's just a suggestion to you. You all can obviously, go down what path you choose, but I think that's the best united front. And then just a quick question. I know you guys referenced the red line document. I would like to get a copy of that, the prior document, just so I can see where you started out to where you got today. And I know there's going to be another document based on the changes today. So for me, it's a process thing, and I would appreciate if I could get a copy of that.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you.
Real quick, I completely agree with you, Elisa, on the collaboration thing. And that's why we had sent out to all the chairs of the committees and boards saying we're going to do it and send the documents out. So I think we at least need to do what we say and send them out to anybody who's asked, and keep everybody, especially planning and selectmen, abreast of what's going on with this. Mr. Robbins, you have your hands up, but you're on mute. You all set, Chris? You're muted, Chris.
Muted.
You got to hit unmute.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you
Well,
go.
what Lisa, John, I think you nailed it on the head. I'd just say ditto. We've got to be close to the needs of the planning board and other key groups to take this thing forward and have the full support of them. And Mimi, it'd be helpful to hear what your input is on this. So I support that fully. Well said, Lisa and John.
Okay, Claire, I think has her hand up. Do I have you muted, Claire? Can you unmute?
Yeah, thanks, John. Just so that everybody is a refresher to everybody, so that they knows, there was a memo that Marika sent out to every single committee and board that told them exactly the process that was going to be used to keep everybody informed, and a team approach. Just as a comment, she only heard back from 2 of the boards.
Yeah, conservation and open space and planning. Planning, we need to make sure.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, so we need
I
to make
just
sure
wanna
we
make
send them stuff,
sure-
as well as selectmen who are appointing board.
Absolutely,
At the very least, in my opinion.
absolutely.
So
Thank you.
thank you. Sorry about that. Anybody else? Ms. Luttrell has her hand up. I'm gonna try to unmute. I think that may have worked. No. Did it work? Nope. Ms. Luttrell, I'm trying to unmute you, but I don't think I can do it. I think Marika needs to.
No, she's asked to unmute. I think you have to do it. Oh yeah,
I'm trying. I think I may
No,
have
she's
done
done.
it.
Yeah.
You're in?
Am I unmuted?
No,
I think
yeah, you
so.
are.
Yep, I heard you. So if I'm answering your question, yes, you are. So just state your name, please, because yeah.
Mimi Luttrell, 19 Oregon Road. Also a member of the planning board, but speaking not for the board, for myself. So I just received a copy of this yesterday, and I think I only received part of it because you're talking about landscaping and signs that I don't have. That those sections aren't in my version. I would like to reiterate what Lisa and John said. I think it's very important that all the major issues on this bylaw be hashed out before it hits a planning board hearing. If we all need to move forward in a united front, if we really want to get this done, getting zoning passed a town meeting with a 2/3 is very difficult. If there's any question, it's not going to pass, as I know very well from past experiences. I have a couple of comments. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. One is that we have a standalone landscaping bylaw, parking bylaw, signage, lighting, that this is in conflict with. Many of the things in those bylaws, which our town has found important, are not things that Grafton found important. So those pieces of this bylaw are in conflict with our bylaw. So I don't know why we wouldn't just refer to those sections that we already have in our bylaw. Also, the downtown village district or village mixed use district needs to be defined. It's not on the zoning map. The Urban Land Institute defined the downtown as from the townhouse all the way down to Route 30, which that encompasses more than the village business district. So it's important to know what we're talking about here. And I think that what's being allowed by right is huge. We're talking about small scale development and, village friendly, but, a 24,000 square foot building is none of those things. And also, the last thing I'll say is that the housing has no affordability requirement, which I think is important. There's nothing to stop us from just getting, 4,000 square foot, very expensive apartments. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mimi. Anyone else? I'm gonna have to bounce.
Yeah, I have a question.
One second.
I'm sorry, John.
1 second, Kathy. I have to bounce.
Yeah.
I asked Julia if she could take the meeting over for me. I will watch the tape later, and I apologize. I just got a totally unexpected giant project that has to be done in 45 minutes. So I have to leave, and I apologize. You still have a quorum.
I'm
so
just looking
Julie,
for
if you
what
could-
we're trying to do
let me
to
just-
give direction.
Okay, you
Okay.
can ask that of Julie as soon as I get off, but just give her 1 second.
Okay.
So Julie, if you could just take a quick roll call without me after I leave, just to make sure you still have a quorum. And then you're all set. And I apologize and thank you, everybody. And I will talk to you soon.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to do a quick roll call. I believe we need 5 people. So I am here. Mike.
Here.
Chris Robbins.
Here.
Rob Anderson.
I'm here.
And Kathy Bartolini.
Here.
All right, so I think we can proceed, and thanks everyone for staying on. I hope we won't go too much longer. I know everyone's really busy, and in full disclosure, I was having a few technical difficulties, so I have missed a couple comments that were cut out. Lisa, unfortunately, I missed part of your comment. I did hear you, Mimi, and I missed a couple other comments earlier, but I think my connection is back up and running. So, but I think, a lot of good points have been raised. This is a great start to the discussion. So thank you for all your participation. I agree, Kathy, we want to probably talk about some next steps. And I know, part of this was cutting out, I believe, Mimi, you said you just got this yesterday, is that correct?
That's correct.
I don't know, maybe, okay. Okay, well, maybe what we want to do is make sure everyone has had, adequate time to review and provide comments before, and then talk about those comments again, and then have, talk about which ones we want Adam to incorporate, what makes most sense. And, this is an art and it's not a science, as, a few people pointed out, we've modeled after, we've looked at other towns, but we're Southborough, we're our own town, we're gonna, there's some things that will work and some that won't. Definitely let's collect everyone's feedback and then work with Adam on a vision.
Madam Temporary Chair, if I may.
Yes.
And this really isn't anything for Adam, but after he cuts off, I would just like to make a comment because that document was sent May 1st after we discussed it per open meeting law, was sent to the person who requested it. This document is a subset. So everything that was formally in the two documents that we're talking about, and they're just documents, everything was sent to the planning board member who requested it May 1st.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, so perhaps we maybe recirculate with a reminder and a deadline for people to provide feedback. Does that make sense? Not a very long deadline, maybe, you know, a week or so.
Yes.
So again, just, you know, I know things are a little wonky right now. Everybody has a different things than normal on their plate. So I just want to make sure that, you know, everybody who wants to weigh in has a chance to, and that we've provided, you know, a reminder opportunity for people to weigh in. So maybe if, Marika, maybe we recirculate with all the documents and ask for comments in a week from now, by the end of next week. I think maybe that is the next, you know, just to put it back on people's radar, because you know, if anyone's like me, they've been a little all over the place lately. So
yeah, Julie. So that was the whole idea. We would have this discussion and then we would send it out to everyone, including EDC if they have comments, but to all the boards and committees. And that's what Claire had communicated with them. So they're expecting it.
Exactly, as communicated at the June 1st meeting also, and sent out after the June 1st meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
So I think if we have any more questions for Adam Costa? Otherwise, I think we should you know, close this part of the meeting.
Yes, I think that's great.
Yeah,
I'm all set.
I think it would be good just to do a wrap up with Adam. Are there any questions that you have based on feedback that you have received from people? Does that give you more direction in terms of hearing from the board and what they think is going to work? And also from hearing from a planning board member in terms of, I think she brought up a very good purpose. We need to, which I can provide, we need to reference in the design standard what is already in the existing bylaws, whether it's lighting and parking and all that, and how that fits into it. And this
Is there a new lighting bylaw or something coming in this town meeting? Or did we vote it at the last town meeting? I know there was a committee that was coming up with provisions for night sky.
It's supposed to be voted on tomorrow, I believe.
That's what I thought. Okay, well, that's just another one. Nights, because lighting really refers usually to the lighting fixtures you're putting on buildings or street lights or whatever, but we have the night sky stuff as well.
Yeah.
Excuse me,
So I'm
Julie,
just
it's
throwing that
Lisa,
out.
if I may for 1 second. So the illumination bylaw is not on the consent agenda for tomorrow. It's, we have asked the proponents of everything non-budget or bonding related to hold off until a fall town meeting. So at this point, it's technically not on for tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you, Lisa.
You're welcome.
You know, I think, but I regardless, I think, you know, that's something that is coming down the pike and, you know, certainly should be on our radar for consideration to, you know, incorporate it, you know, or at least have it in mind, you know, provisionally anticipating that some sort of lighting bylaw will be, you know, on the books in the near future. So thank you.
So, through you, Madam Chair, Claire had asked a few questions of me just with regard to whether I've received the additional guidance that I need. So, you know, I think the answer to that is sort of yes and no. I think that this was a productive conversation, and a number of new questions arose, and we had quite a bit of discussion concerning the 3 points that I laid out at the start of the meeting. I think the answer with respect to those 3 points is that the committee doesn't have an answer entirely yet. Number one, because you've not had much of an opportunity to mull these concepts over. They were just presented to you either in the bylaw revisions you got from me a week or so ago, or in the discussion we had today. You're awaiting feedback from different boards and commissions and committees, including, importantly, the planning board and maybe the Board of Selectmen. So I've gotten a sense as to where we are, and I've gotten a sense as to what individual committee members' thoughts are, concerns are, opinions are on certain approaches. But we do need to achieve some consensus, and that's not going to occur today, but in the coming days or weeks, how we're going to address these things. So I heard a general opinion, at least from 2 or 3 members of the committee, that there is certainly a desire for this bylaw, this overlay district, to operate as an incentive to developers. And I read that to mean that you want it to be optional, you want it to be, it's available to developers, but not obligatory, that the underlying zoning will continue to survive and continue to operate, and that applicants will have an opportunity to utilize it. Well, if that's the case, then we have, and I need to know from the committee as a whole, after you've deliberated amongst yourselves and consulted with other boards and commissions, that that's your approach, that's your preferred approach in your opinion, in which case we're going to have to rework the applicability section to address that circumstance, and to clarify in the uses section that even though we're not addressing every use that would be permitted in the underlying zoning district, that those uses will continue to be allowed pursuant to the underlying zoning. So that's something that needs to be resolved through further discussion. We've also talked about process. We talked about site plan review versus special permit. Again, there needs to be a consensus that you do want to subject by right uses, all by right uses, or some by right uses, to a site plan review process. And if you're simply relying upon the existing underlying zoning and the provisions concerning site plan review, you would not be subjecting all or even most of the by right uses to site plan review. You would be subjecting some of them to it, but not all of them to it. And then finally, we have to work through these performance standards and design standards and either convert them to true standards, salvage them, work them back into the bylaw, maybe with a waiver provision, to continue to keep them out of the bylaw and craft a second document that would be proposed guidelines, presumably by the planning board as the permit granting authority. So these are the discussions that need to continue to be had. Certainly, I agree with all the comments that were made about the importance of involving the planning board. I appreciate, as someone that often acts as the liaison, sending requests for comment out on behalf of boards I'm assisting to other boards and commissions, that sometimes you don't get immediate responses. Sometimes you don't get comment, especially this day and age with COVID-19 and municipal building closures. It's more difficult than ever. What I've also found is that doesn't prevent those boards, those municipal officials from standing up at town meeting and saying, we were never consulted on this, and therefore we oppose it. And again, where you need a 2/3 vote, that's problematic. So involving these other boards and commissions and committees and continuing to be proactive about reaching out to them and seeking their input, I think that that's critical. It's especially critical with the planning board, where the planning board is going to be the administering authority, be it site plan review, be it special permit. They're going to be implementing this bylaw. So you want to adopt a bylaw that they're comfortable with, that serves the purposes that you intended to serve, but is also something that is flexible enough that they can apply it, they can work within the confines of the structure that you're creating.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, I think those are all great points for us to keep in mind as we're working through this. And I think what we'll do is we'll put out a new request for everyone to review it, and we'll get back to you with the feedback, keeping all of those points in mind, and work together to revise it as necessary.
And if I could, Madam Chair, I would just recommend to Claire and Marika, to the extent that they can, I don't want this to be viewed, the bylaw as was circulated for today's meeting, as eliminating provisions that existed before, specifically the design guidelines and really the entirety of the performance standards. I appreciate why those were eliminated from the document that was circulated based upon a recommendation from staff that may be the way to go. But I suspect that if the planning board were to see this, whatever it is, 5 or 6 page document and only this, not only eliminating the highly subjective design standards, but also eliminating all of the more objective standards relative to parking and landscaping and trash and pedestrian access, that's going to raise some immediate red flags. So it may make some sense to circulate that document as a clean version, but also circulate the document that I provided back a week ago today that had all of my red line changes and the same comments, but that preserves some of that information simply with my comment that eliminating it in whole or in part may be something that the committee wants to consider.
That's a great point, Adam, and I fully agree with you. Marika, you got all that? You're good
Yeah.
with that?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks again for your time, Adam, and all your work on this. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Okay, thank you all for your time. I'll jump off now. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Julie, I just want to say that Mimi has raised her hand.
Okay.
Let me just see if I can.
Never mind. I was going to comment on the lighting bylaw, but Lisa answered it. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, so I think we have some minutes to approve.
No, sorry, I don't have the minutes yet. Next meeting, sorry.
Okay.
We do have next on the agenda, I think I had sent an email to Board of Selectmen as well as Jim Haggerty to see if we could change the EDC committee to a 7-member committee, especially now that Kathy won't be renewing her term. I haven't heard back from them, but maybe it's a good idea to vote on that.
Okay. All right, does someone want to make a motion to reduce the size of our committee to 7 members?
Yeah, I'll make that motion. I make the motion to reduce the number of members on the Southborough Economic Development Committee to 7.
Kathy Bartolini seconds.
Is there any discussion on this? Just for the benefit of our audience, this is something we talked about a little bit. Obviously, we've had a couple of members drop off recently in light of current situations. You know, we didn't think that recruiting several new members at this point was, you know, the best option. And, you know, we used to be a 7-member committee. We think that for now that this would be the best way to move forward to make sure that we can maintain quorum and continue business running, especially while we're having to operate remotely. So if there's no other, anyone else have any questions or comments? All right, all in favor, we'll do a roll call. Mike?
Yes.
I vote yes. Chris Robbins?
Yes.
Is Mike there?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I just
Michael
didn't hear
Murray
him.
voted yes.
I don't hear him when he votes.
All right.
Okay, Kathy
Yes.
and Rob?
Yes.
Okay, vote carries. Thank you.
Sorry, Julie, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's a public comment at this point, but Mimi has raised her hand. Let me ask.
Sure.
Going back to the zoning, I'm responding to a chat from Claire that says that the mixed-use village business district is using the zoning map. but it's not defined on the zoning map. There's only one village business district, which encompasses 3. So just to be clear, it needs to be defined what we're talking about with this mixed use.
I don't know if I can talk to this, but there is a map. There's like a pink. It is defined on the zoning map. The business village district is comprised of 3 areas, and the area we are talking about is the downtown business village district. I mean, there's no different name for it, but that's the area. We can use, you know, I don't know, GPS coordinates, or we can just call it the downtown business village district as opposed to the Fayetteville or the Southville business village
Yeah,
district.
it's
And
the
it's like a-
northernmost of the 3 business districts.
Correct, but that needs to be defined, because if you say refer to the zoning map, the zoning map doesn't define each 3 sections.
Understood. And as Adam suggested in the document that you have to define it, I have actually sat and identified all the parcel IDs from the assessor's map.
Perfect. So it's just going to be what is part of the village business district, which is in the downtown now, that area?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay,
that
Great.
exact area.
great, thanks.
Yeah. All right, Julie, I think we just had the vote.
Yep.
Are you still on?
And it's carried. So vice chair report, that's John, but I did want to just take a quick minute to say that I sat in last week on the master planning committee meeting. I know Kathy's going to be stepping down from the EDC at the end of this month, and therefore she won't be able to be the EDC representative for master planning committee. So I do intend to take over that role if this committee wants me to do that. I think maybe we should vote on that. Did we vote on that last time? I know we discussed it, but I think I was still, I don't remember. Sorry.
You were iffy. You weren't sure you would have the time.
Yeah, I was on the fence of whether I wanted to take on another commitment at this time. I'm a little bit spread thin, but I felt like, you know, it's an issue I care a lot about. So I did sit in on the meeting last week, and I am happy to join that committee if that committee will have me, and if you guys will allow it. So do we want to, I don't know what the proper procedure is, but I assume we will want to vote on it here. And then, you know, that doesn't mean I'm appointed, but that means maybe I could ask the master planning committee if I could be appointed to their committee as the EDC rep. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I'll make a motion that the EDC designate Julie Conley to take the EDC slot on the master planning committee. I'm not sure the master plan committee can say no. I think it's a unilateral decision of each of the designated seats that they have a seat, but you have to be a member of that board.
Sure. Okay. Either way.
So we have a
Anyone second
Done
that?
but that makes sense.
Yeah, second. I second.
All right, I will do.
Yeah.
I will, thank you. I will do, can I vote on that? I can vote on that, right?
Yes, you can vote.
Okay. Mike?
Yes.
I vote yes. Chris?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Kathy?
Yes.
Thanks, everyone. So as a non-member, I just mostly listened last time. I was not on the panel. I was just an audience participant. And just as an update to this committee, what they did was they went through their, they reviewed their survey results that they put out a survey a couple months ago, and just to the residents to discuss the, to get kind of let people weigh in on the the, you know, the direction of the town, things that were important. Most of the questions were framed as, you know, how important is this aspect of you know, the planning for the future to you, with questions ranging from everything, you know, I'd say a third, or at least a third of the questions were very relevant to economic development and the downtown and different amenities that we would want to potentially have available. Overlapped with a lot of the survey questions that we had put out a few years ago, including things, you know, that are not directly economic development, but that relate to a lot of the things we've talked about, like trails and, you know, walkability and pedestrian access and things like that as well. The survey results are available on the town website, so they're really interesting. They one thing they discussed was the sample size. It is, you know, they think they got about 280 some odd responses, which, you know, just I think was maybe less than they had hoped for, but I think there are a lot of factors that contribute to you know, the lower response just based on the timing and where we are right now. But it is a statistically significant sample size, so I don't think they should have a problem relying on it. And from what I could tell from a quick assessment, that, you know, it seemed, you know, to the extent it overlapped with the survey EDC had put out a few years ago, you know, the questions that pertain to economic development and the sort of other periphery factors that we asked about, you know, seemed to be about status quo. I didn't see any significant change. Again, the questions weren't directly the same, but to the extent they were similar, there seems to be some strong and fairly broad-based support for a lot of the for downtown improvements and you know, some of the that
You're breaking out.
discussed as well. Sorry?
Yeah, we're losing you a little bit, Julie.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can now.
Activity issues earlier in the year.
Now you're just breaking up a little bit, so I don't know if you.
I need to leave for 1 o'clock, so I just.
Yeah, I was
Julie?
thinking with Julie kind of breaking up, maybe it makes sense for us to adjourn.
Yeah. Julie, are you still there? Yeah, because we would have lost quorum. Yeah. I can't hear.
Yeah.
So who would like to chair the meeting?
Kathy, this is your chance.
Yeah, it could be when is our next meeting before we adjourn?
We don't have anything planned as of yet.
Do we need something planned? Do we know when we're getting the next product from Adam? Do we know?
No, not yet. I think once we know a little bit more, I'll be sending out an email. So,
is on the agenda today any discussion about EDC helping restaurants to open?
Well, that was going to be in my report, coordinator report. I don't want to talk too much about other matters because I send you an update every week. Just wanted to let you know that I actually sent an email. I had sent out the South Road Toolkit, like ideas of how we could help our businesses during this time. I had sent it out to most departments as well as Board of Selectmen and Town Administrator. I hadn't heard back from them. And the other thing is I've been in touch with restaurants. I've been calling all the restaurants. I know Ola is eager to start outdoor dining. So I wanted to know how that would work. So I was in touch with several departments and everyone has their own kind of rules and regulations. I thought it would be better to maybe do a top-down approach. And I used, Rob, your information that was very helpful that you had sent me to come up with a Southborough temporary outdoor dining regulation, which I sent to Board of Selectmen and Mark Purple to see if they could, at least discuss it, or because people are, want to start right now. We don't have a lot of time, to wait. So I'm having a meeting on Monday with like 15 people. So I'm not sure. I'll see. But I wish.
Are they town officials or are they
Town
owners
officials.
of restaurants?
No, they're
Okay.
like fire department, building inspector, Mark, Vanessa. I mean, basically everyone. But I'm thinking, so that's one approach. I'm thinking the Board of Selectmen should probably vote on something from the top down so we can move faster. But I'm working
Right.
on it. Yeah. So that's what's happening most.
You mentioned the memo that I sent you yesterday, or you want me to do it?
Well, the only thing, Kathy, I'm just wondering, are we allowed to talk because we don't have quorum? Because I think Julie.
Did we
I'm
lose
back on,
quorum?
Sorry.
Oh,
I'm
we
here.
do?
Oh, she's
Yeah.
back on. Okay.
All right, great.
Sorry about that. I'm just having some,
Okay.
I cut out for a minute. I couldn't hear you, but I've been hearing the last couple minutes, so.
While you were gone, we were talking about how and if and how the EDC helps our local restaurants in particular, but businesses also, to open under the governor's guidelines. And
Yeah.
one of the things that happened yesterday, the governor announced a new program, and the applicants are municipalities, where, and the RFP isn't going to be out till the 22nd, but that I think is next week, that will give money to municipalities to improve the sidewalks, to improve the curb cuts or curbing that may have, not fared well during our many weather seasons, and to do other kinds of things that would enable the businesses, and particularly the restaurants, to utilize the sidewalks during these temporary provisions that everybody has to be outside. And the grants run from $300,000 to $400,000. Well, I think he said it that way because the RFP isn't written and he himself doesn't know what the maximum grant is. But it would be, I think, as I've tried to write memos to Marika about what are the issues relative to, say, Ola opening, and where would the tables be, and how would the pedestrians be safe from the vehicular, and are we talking about takeout and then eating outside, or is wait staff coming out and waiting on people, more conventional dining? Then you've got wait staff and vehicular issues and stuff like that. And I think particularly for our downtown area, it also funds bicycle paths and sidewalk improvements to the schools and to the downtowns. So there are people that we could collaborate with, the Trails Committee and Open Space, whatever, and I think we need to talk to Karen before we start talking about doing sidewalk improvements in the downtown before phase 2 gets done. But I don't want us to miss out on this opportunity to physically improve the downtown and maybe do some of those physical improvements to help the businesses, as opposed to telling them the road's only getting done and everything else is on your buck. You there? Or am I out?
You're there.
I guess I lost.
Yeah, Kathy. So I saw.
Oh. Hello?
Spoken about in the context of our downtown initiative.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I heard you. I'm here. I heard you said you spoke about it as a downtown initiative, and then you faded out again.
My internet. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
So I don't know if you heard me earlier, but I think it's great, and I think we should look out for it and apply. And I think this is more something in the context of our downtown initiative that we've been talking about. What I was talking about earlier was more a short-term, immediate need for restaurants to be allowed outdoor service, because they are not allowed yet to have indoor seating. And even if once they have, they won't be able to run on full capacity. So they're two separate
And that's
things.
what this state grant is for too. I mean, that's why it's so fast that it got announced out of the blue yesterday, and the RFPs are due on the 22nd, because the governor's office received feedback from the municipalities, as opposed to the businesses, that they don't have the money to fix all the issues. You know, it's wonderful if you're the city of Boston or Worcester or something like that, where the space exists, but the small towns do not have, in some cases, sidewalks, or they don't have sidewalks that have been repaired in recent history, and that this money even goes for the purchase of Jersey barriers to try to separate people. But the intent is even to have this handled before September for the kids getting to school, assuming we open. The other reason I'm bringing it up is, if we don't have a meeting scheduled, we have an RFP coming out on the 22nd that I would suggest we meet between now and the last week, meet the last week of the month to look at whether or not this RFP meets our needs, and what else and if it doesn't, what else can we do to help these businesses, because the restaurants are hanging on by their fingernails.
Well, I don't know if you saw the document, Kathy, that I sent. Did you read the attachment? It's called Toolkit Southborough.
I don't know at this point. I've had so many emails back and forth, but I read everything you send to me.
Yeah,
so.
Really, I appreciate that. No, but if that was just like a document with a lot of things that we could do to help businesses. So, I mean, one of the two things basically that we're doing right now is we are applying for a grant for micro enterprises. So hopefully by the end of this month, we'll hear if we get money. And we'll have to reach out and try to figure out who would be eligible for this. And secondly, which would be an immediate need, is for the town to allow the few restaurants that we have and are interested, to allow for them to just have tables out on their parking lot for dining. And right now it's only Ola, and if they were already measuring out everything, they want to start by next week if possible. And I know Red Barn Cafe, they put out like 3 tables on their parking lot in front. And I mean, those small little things, that's what we're talking about right now. And I think what you're talking about is very interesting and would be very helpful, which would be more for the, I guess, not the future, but the medium term, which would be something I think they could use as well.
Okay, I was just going to go for it now because it will help. It will decrease the amount of money that we need to come up with to improve the physical appearance of the downtown, to incentivize it for others to open their businesses there. But
okay,
because I don't know where that money's coming from.
One last thing on my report is
I'm sorry, Marika. I need to. It's been close to 2 hours. I do actually have to get back to work here at my job. I do need to sign off, and I do realize that it's going to end the quorum for the committee. So I just want to give you a heads up that I did need to sign off to sign off now.
Okay, I think that's fine. I mean, I don't have anything else. Julie?
Sure. Can we just make sure there's no other public comment real quick? I'm totally with you there, Rob. It's the middle of my birthday too.
Okay, Mimi, I think Mimi has her hand up. Mimi?
I don't. It must be stuck up from the first time I put it up.
All right, then we're all set.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
I make a motion that we adjourn.
Second.
Roll call. Aye. Chris?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Kathy?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Hey, all.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.